Okay, so we really need to talk about what's happening on college campuses right now. It's a full-blown mental health crisis. We're seeing rates of anxiety, depression, and even suicidal thoughts at an all-time high. So in this explainer, we're going to unpack what this actually means, not just for the students, but for the faculty who are right there on the front lines with them.
And to really, truly grasp the scale of this, we've got to look past the numbers for a second. This quote right here from Jim Perez, an adjunct professor in Chicago, it just gives you this window into the human side of all this data. This isn't just a student having an off day. This is about a consistent, debilitating struggle that professors are witnessing firsthand every single day. And, that's not even a one-off story. Professor Perez shared another one about a student who showed up to his class literally moments after learning her aunt was a victim in a triple homicide. I mean, just let that sink in. This is the kind of profound trauma students are trying to juggle while still somehow keeping up with their coursework. It's just immense.
Okay, so these personal accounts are incredibly powerful, right? And they really point to a much, much larger trend. So now let's actually turn to the data. We're going to look at a major national survey to see just how widespread this crisis has become. And fair warning, the numbers, they're pretty staggering.
All right, just take a look at this number. Over 60%. That is the majority of college students today. According to the Healthy Minds survey, this is a nearly 50% jump since just 2013. Think about that. This isn't just a problem anymore. It's practically becoming the new normal on campus.
So let's dig a little deeper. If we zero in on just depression, a whopping 44% of students are reporting symptoms. That's almost half the entire student body. To put it in the words of one study, they're feeling so depressed that they couldn't function.
And it's not just depression either. On top of that, anxiety is hitting more than a third of all students. All the pressure, the stress, the constant uncertainty, it all adds up and it really takes a toll. This data just shows how incredibly common this experience is on campuses everywhere.
And then there's this number, 15%. 15% of students have seriously considered suicide. And what's so crucial to understand here is that this is the highest rate ever recorded in the 15-year history of this survey. It's an undeniable sign that this crisis is not just here, it's getting worse.
So you see, these numbers don't just exist in a vacuum. They have very real-world consequences for a student's ability to even make it through college. So now let's take a look at how this crisis is impacting everything, from whether a student decides to stay in school to who is actually able to get the help they need.
Wow, okay, this chart really drives the point home. Get this, 4 out of every 10 students have thought about dropping out. And the number one reason why? For bachelor's degree students, it's emotional stress. That's way higher than worries about how much their degree costs. Just think about that. For so many students, their own mental well-being is now the biggest hurdle to finishing college. And Professor Candace Shivers puts it perfectly. A lot of students aren't just students, right? They're also caregivers. They're employees. Many are working multiple jobs. So when life just becomes overwhelming, school is often the first thing that has to give. It's not about a lack of willpower. It's about running out of capacity.
But here's where it gets even more complicated. This crisis doesn't hit everyone the same way, especially when you look at who can actually get help. While mental health struggles are happening across all racial groups, this chart shows a really stark divide in who actually gets treatment. White students are almost twice as likely as Black students to receive mental health care. So what's going on here? What's causing this huge gap?
Well, a huge part of the problem is the lack of something called culturally competent care. What does that mean? Basically, the vast majority of college counselors are white, and that can make it incredibly difficult for students of color to find a therapist who genuinely gets their lived experiences. Everything from dealing with language barriers to the daily weight of systemic racism. It makes it so much harder to even reach out for help, let alone get care that actually works.
So let's just recap for a second. We've got a record number of students who are struggling, and at the same time, there are these massive barriers keeping many of them from getting care. All of this creates an even bigger problem. The support system on campus itself is, it's at its breaking point.
It really is the perfect storm. I mean, even before the pandemic, 90% of college counseling centers were already reporting a huge surge in demand. And what's the result of that? You get crazy long wait lists, counselors who are totally burned out and leaving the field, and a massive shortage of diverse mental health professionals. So who's left to pick up the pieces? Yeah, more often than not, it's the faculty.
And this quote from Professor Perez just captures that frustration perfectly. The administration might say, oh, the help is there. But then students come back and say, I couldn't get in. Now what? Imagine finally working up their courage to ask for help, only to be told you have to wait for weeks. It must feel like hitting a brick wall, just leaving you with nowhere to turn.
And this puts faculty in a completely impossible position. Many of them, especially adjuncts, are already juggling multiple jobs just to get by, and a lot of them don't even have their own health benefits. And yet, they are the ones on the front lines. They're the first people students go to in a crisis. The system is basically asking people who are untrained and unsupported to handle a mental health emergency.
Look, it's a really tough situation, I know, but it's not hopeless. There is a path forward. The National Education Association has actually laid out some very clear, concrete steps that schools can take to start addressing this crisis. So what can actually be done?
The most important takeaway here is that there's no magic bullet. It's really a three-pronged approach. First, schools have got to hire more mental health professionals who actually reflect the diversity of their students. That's absolutely key to providing that culturally competent care we were just talking about. Second, all faculty and staff need training. And listen, this isn't about turning them into therapists. It's about empowering them to recognize when a student is in distress and know exactly how to get them to the right resources. And finally, number 3, the whole campus culture needs to shift to be more inclusive and supportive for everybody.
So in the end, this is about so much more than just a quick fix. I love how Professor Perez put it. The whole organism is sick. And the real goal here is to heal that organism, to build a system of higher education where mental well-being isn't some add-on or an afterthought, but a fundamental, core part of what it means to thrive and be successful.
And that really leaves us with a final big question to think about. It's one thing to talk about policies and resources, but what does a campus that truly prioritizes well-being actually look like? What would it feel like? And what are the real changes needed to make that a reality for every single